This is the story of a family that looked perfect from the outside. Smiling photos, pregnancy announcements, plans for the future. And then in a single night, everything vanished. What happened inside that Colorado home shocked the world, not because the danger came from a stranger, but from the person they trusted most. On the surface, it looked like a postcard life. Smiling family photos, coordinated outfits, carefully framed moments of domestic happiness shared online. Shannan, expectant with her third child, talked openly about her gratitude for a second chance at love and family. Two little girls filled the house with the kind of energy that makes chaos feel joyful rather than messy. To friends and relatives, this was a story still being written, one heading toward new beginnings rather than abrupt endings. But even within the most polished picture, silence can hide tension, and the absence of visible cracks does not mean the foundation is not shifting beneath it. In the summer of 2018, subtle changes began to register, nothing dramatic enough to be obvious to everyone at once, but noticeable in hindsight. Messages were shorter, phone calls less warm, routines slightly off. Shannan was traveling more for work, trying to balance motherhood, marriage, and pregnancy. She confided to friends about strain in the relationship, trying to understand whether the distance she felt was temporary or something more permanent. She still held on to hope, even when she sensed something was wrong. She believed in confronting problems, in fixing, in talking through the storm. The contrast between the versions of life presented online and the emotional reality inside the home became increasingly stark. Chris, who had once seemed attentive and quiet in a comforting way, now appeared quiet in another register, withdrawn, distracted, and difficult to read. He was changing physically too, losing weight, investing more time in himself, in his appearance. Friends noticed a difference, but often framed it positively. People rarely imagine the darkest explanations first. The idea that danger could grow so close right inside the heart of a family felt unthinkable. The final days before Shannan's disappearance were full of tiny details that now feel unbearably heavy. A late return flight. A tired but determined mother dragging her suitcase up to a dark house. The habitual check-ins with friends. Home safe. The lingering sense of unease she had expressed about the distance in her marriage, threaded through text messages that only later would be read as evidence. She was still trying to make the relationship work, still analyzing every gesture for meaning, still trying to protect her children and the future she imagined for them. Monday morning arrived with ordinary expectations. There should have been movement, breakfast routines, children's voices, schedules to meet, appointments to keep. Instead, there was silence. Messages to Shannan went unanswered. Calls went straight to voicemail. A doctor's appointment she never would have casually missed passed by without her arrival. The first ripple of worry came not as panic, but as confusion, the kind of confusion that grows heavy very quickly when someone responsible and organized simply vanishes from the pattern of their own life. A close friend noticed first. Concern replaced curiosity when hours went by with no response, and worry solidified into alarm as attempts to reach Shannan failed again and again. The friend went to the house, knocked, called, waited. The car was there. Belongings were there. But Shannan and the children were not. Something did not add up, not in a small way, but in a way that makes instinct sharpen. A welfare check was requested. Police officers arrived. The front door opened not onto the usual morning chaos of young children, but onto absence. Chris arrived during the welfare check, presenting calm where others were visibly anxious. He spoke about arguments, about uncertainty, about the idea that maybe Shannan had left to clear her head. His tone felt strangely muted to some observers, measured where people expected panic, control where they expected frantic questions. He walked through the house pointing out what was missing and what was not, narrating absence as if it were a puzzle he was slightly detached from solving. The beds empty, the children's rooms undisturbed, the phone inexplicably left behind, each detail deep in the sense that this was not a voluntary disappearance. Within hours, the story moved from neighborhood concern to national attention. The image of a husband standing in front of television cameras, pleading for the return of his pregnant wife and daughters, spread quickly. What lodged in the public mind was not just what he said, but how he said it. The careful phrasing, the lack of visible anguish, the oddly rehearsed tone. It was as if he was performing a role he had watched before, hitting lines rather than feelings. Viewers felt an unease they could not fully articulate, and investigators noted the same thing. Something was not aligning between words and emotion. Behind the scenes, professionals were already assembling timelines. They followed digital traces, text messages, location data, call logs, the ordinary footprints of modern life. They talked to friends, co-workers, neighbors. The story Chris told began to wobble under the weight of corroborated facts. While he spoke publicly of hope, his private behavior and inconsistencies drew attention inside the interrogation room. The disconnect between his composure and the escalating gravity of the situation became impossible to ignore. Then came the detail that shifted the investigation decisively: the neighbor security camera footage. In the early morning hours, while the neighborhood slept, it recorded activity in front of the Watts home. It showed movement, a truck, repeated trips between house and vehicle. It did not show Shannan and the girls leaving alive and well. What it did show contradicted Chris's narrative, and when he stood beside officers watching the footage, the neighbor later recalled that his demeanor changed: nervous, talkative, suddenly unsettled. The camera, indifferent and silent, had captured something he could not explain away. For the public, the case felt like watching the slow shattering of an illusion. A father who had been seen as gentle was now the focus of intense suspicion. The idea of danger from strangers was replaced by a more terrifying realization: sometimes the greatest threat comes from the person trusted most. People felt anger for Shannan, who had tried to hold her family together. Grief for two small children who depended on the adult who should have protected them. And a deep, sickening sense of betrayal that radiated far beyond the family and into the broader community. Investigators, methodical rather than emotional, tightened the circle. They asked again. They compared again. They looked at patterns of communication and financial strain, at relationship secrets, at the stark contrast between public presentation and private reality. Every new piece of information added weight to the growing suspicion that this was not a disappearance, but something far worse. Still, there was a stubborn hope in many hearts that the ending might not be as devastating as it appeared to be, becoming. The first section of the story ends not with resolution, but with a heavy pause a moment before truth breaks through denial. A house once full of life now stood as a crime scene in all but name. Friends and neighbors lingered between shock and dread. The nation watched, trying to reconcile smiling family photos with the chilling possibility that the man asking for help on television might be the one responsible for the very horror he described. What began as a missing person case was quietly transforming into something darker, and the line between appearance and reality had all but collapsed. The most haunting part, even at this early stage, was the realization that the answers were likely already known by the one person speaking most publicly about finding them. Cracks in the story rarely appear as dramatic revelations at first. They show up as small misalignments, details that do not quite fit, tones that do not match the words being spoken, explanations that seem practiced instead of lived. In this case, those cracks began to widen the moment Chris's calm narrative met the weight of verifiable facts. He had built a version of events that depended on uncertainty, on the idea that Shannan had simply left. Evidence, however, began quietly telling a different story. The neighbor security camera was the first undeniable fracture. It showed the early morning movement of his truck and the repetitive trips between the house and the driveway. Investigators compared that footage to what Chris had reported and saw the gap between nothing unusual and what the camera had actually captured. They did not need his emotions to prove anything anymore. The lens had recorded what words could not erase. Technology, impartial and unfeeling, became a witness where no human eyes had seen. Inside the interview room, the tone of questioning shifted accordingly. Detectives, already aware of the footage and other inconsistencies, guided the conversation with care. They allowed silence to stretch. They asked the same question in different ways, watching not just the answers, but the pauses before them. They noticed when he avoided saying the girls' names, when he spoke about them as if they were already distant. The human instinct to protect, to panic, to despair when loved ones are missing, those reactions were notably absent. The investigation into his private life began, revealing more context. Records confirmed the existence of an affair. Internet searches and messages showed planning and fantasy about a different future one, without the responsibilities he had built. Financial strain surfaced. These pieces did not, on their own, prove murder, but they painted a picture of motive, a man looking for escape rather than repair, imagining freedom instead of accountability. They suggested that for him, love had become something conditional, measured against inconvenience. Shannan, meanwhile, emerged from her messages and videos as painfully human, hopeful, anxious, determined. She tried to make the marriage work. She asked questions. She confronted emotional distance honestly. Friends later said she still believed there was something left to save. Reading her words after the fact is heartbreaking because they are filled with everyday vulnerability. not fear of violence. She was trying to fix what was breaking, unaware that the person she was trying to fix it would have already crossed a line in his own mind. When investigators invited him to take a polygraph examination, he agreed. It is not the machine itself that holds power. It is the confidence with which people walk into the room. The examiner's calm explanation set the stage. There was only one good outcome: to tell the truth. Afterward, when results suggested deception, the facade of certainty he had worn began to falter. He was confronted gently at first, and then directly. Detectives explained that the story he had been repeating was not supported by evidence. They urged him to be honest for himself, for his family, for the possibility of recovering the missing. Even then, he clung to fragments of control. He tried to shift blame, to construct narratives that minimized his responsibility, to suggest that something else, someone else, was to blame for the worst of what happened. This instinct to keep power over the story even after facts had overtaken it added another layer to public outrage. It showed calculation, not confusion. Preservation of self-image instead of remorse. The moment when truth edges into the open in such cases is never cinematic. It is slow, painful, and stark. Confronted with mounting evidence, with the knowledge of the camera footage, the phone records, the interviews, and the failed polygraph formed an unbreakable chain, he finally admitted the essential fact. They were gone because of him. Investigators listened not as spectators, but as people whose job now included locating the victims and bringing them home from the limbo of missing into the dignity of being found. The emotional impact of that admission radiated outward. For detectives, the room shifted from uncertainty to grim clarity. For Shannan's family, the thin thread of hope snapped. For the public, anger replaced doubt. The idea that a father, someone entrusted with the ultimate duty to protect, could become the source of fatal harm struck at something primal. It shattered the comforting illusion that danger always comes from outside, from strangers and shadows rather than from the person sitting at the same dinner table. The neighbors. Camera took on symbolic meaning in the aftermath. It became the embodiment of truth, quietly watching, an accidental guardian of accountability. Without that footage, the case might still have been solved, but it would not have been so swiftly reframed from disappearance to homicide. Ordinary technology installed for security, not investigation, exposed the gap between performance and reality. It reminded everyone that actions leave traces, even when someone believes they are acting in darkness. Meanwhile, community reaction intensified. Candlelight vigils formed. Posters transformed from pleas into memorials. People struggled with the duality of memory. The smiling family images contrasted with the horror of what had actually occurred. Many found themselves rewatching his earlier interviews with a different lens, picking up on the stiffness, the lack of urgency, the way he kept circling back to himself rather than the missing. What once looked merely awkward now seemed chilling. The timeline investigators reconstructed was clinical but devastating. It showed opportunity, means, and motive intersecting in those early hours when the house was quiet. It showed attempts to hide rather than to help. It demonstrated that the disappearance narrative was never about searching for loved ones. It was about buying time. Each data point: door sensors, text message logs, workplace information fitted into a mosaic that pointed in only one direction. At this stage, compassion flowed almost entirely towards Shannan and the children. People saw a pregnant mother trying to navigate marital tension with honesty and courage, and two little girls whose lives had barely begun. They thought about the ordinary futures that had been taken from them. First days of school, inside jokes, teenage milestones, adulthood. Grief for lost potential often hurts, as much as grief for the lives themselves. There is also a deeper discomfort that cases like this leave behind. If someone who looked outwardly calm, even shy, could harbor such lethal decisions, how well do we truly know the people around us? That question haunted friends, co-workers, and neighbors. They replayed conversations in their minds, searching for missed signals, wondering whether there had been a moment when intervention could have changed the trajectory. The tragedy created ripples of guilt in people who were never responsible, simply because they cared. Legally, the path forward after admission became clearer. The focus turned to recovery, documentation, and ensuring that the victim's story, not the perpetrator's excuses, would anchor the record. Investigators maintained professionalism in the face of emotional weight. Their job required them to transform grief into procedure, outrage into evidence. It is one of the harshest demands placed upon them, to speak calmly about events that are anything but calm. Section 3 closes at the point where lies have finally collapsed under truth. The performance has ended. The mask that held for days could not survive the pressure of facts, the gaze of the camera, the patience of investigators, or the quiet insistence of reality. What remains is the raw recognition of what was done and by whom. The next step is accountability, not speculation. A reckoning in court rather than in rumor. But no verdict, however appropriate, can rewrite what occurred in that house or return what was taken. The story now moves from deception to consequence, from suspicion to an unflinching look at what happens after the truth emerges. The night of the disappearance does not begin with a scream. It begins with routine. That is what makes it so haunting to retrace. A family house at rest, a dark suburban street. Lights switching off one by one as the neighborhood slides into sleep. Nothing about the scene announces catastrophe. There are no witnesses who hear chaos, no dramatic calls for help. Only the quiet passage of hours that later become unbearably significant because of what they contained. In the early hours of that morning, time feels split in two, the version that everyone outside the house experienced ordinary, forgettable, and the version inside, where crucial moments unfolded unseen. Investigators would later reconstruct this period with painstaking care, building the narrative minute by minute from digital traces, movement records, and behavior after the fact. But during those hours, the world simply slept, unaware that the line between missing and gone forever had already been crossed. By daylight, the absence had become total. Toys did not move. Breakfast did not happen. A mother who always responded to messages stopped answering altogether. When police entered the home for the welfare check, it did not look like a family that had packed up and left. Shannan's purse, medications, phone items she would never leave behind were still there. The children's belongings were in place, as if awaiting their small owner's return. That static normality made the silence louder, like a hell breath that just keeps going. Chris described the night in a simple storyline. He claimed there had been an emotional conversation, that Shannan had talked about leaving, that she might have taken the children somewhere. He repeated it often, as if repetition would make it true, but the story had gaps that widened quickly under scrutiny. There was no note, no messages of friends saying she needed space, no evidence she had driven away with the girls. Instead, there was only the strange combination of missing people and left behind essentials a pattern investigators have seen before and do not mistake for coincidence. What set this case apart in the public imagination was what happened next. He stepped in front of television cameras. Standing in the driveway, beside the house now heavy with suspicion, Chris appealed for his family to come home. The words he spoke sounded, on the surface, like what a worried husband and father would say. But everything around the words felt off, his posture, the flat quality of his tone, his eyes moving not with desperation, but with calculation. He folded his arms as he spoke, rocking slightly, giving answers that seemed to avoid the emotional center of the situation. Viewers felt a chill they struggled to explain. Their instincts told them grief did not look like this. Meanwhile, inside the police department, the case was gaining intensity by the hour. Detectives were not evaluating emotion alone. They were comparing statements to facts. They traced phone activity. They looked at work records. They reviewed GPS logs. They examined the timeline of the night and morning down to small increments. The goal was simple, align behavior to reality. And in that alignment, inconsistencies began to shine like beacons. Then came the neighbor's camera, the unblinking witness. The footage captured the early morning darkness outside the Watts home, illuminated periodically by the garage light and the movement of a truck. It showed Chris making multiple trips between the house and his work vehicle. It did not show Shannan leaving with the children. The neighbor, familiar with the normal rhythms of the street, immediately sensed something was unusual. When officers played the video in his living room, Chris stood watching too, and his reaction did not go unnoticed. He became suddenly talkative, trying to control the narrative, while the officer quietly observed the shift with growing suspicion. This camera footage did more than contradict his words. It punctured the illusion of uncertainty. It suggested planning, heavy lifting, purposeful activity long before anybody reported a disappearance. It was a first clear sign that what happened that night was not simply a family dispute that escalated into impulsive departure. For investigators trained in reading behavior, it hinted at something far darker and more deliberate. The search effort expanded rapidly. Canine units were brought in. The media clustered outside. Friends and family posted pleas across social media, their messages raw with fear and disbelief. For them, hoping was the only thing left to do. They remembered Shannan as a mother who documented her children's milestones, who talked excitedly about the baby she was expecting, who made plans rather than disappearances. The idea that she had simply vanished with both daughters and no preparation went against everything they knew about her. Inside the interrogation room, the tone shifted from conversational to confrontational. Detectives challenged Chris gently at first, then with increasing directness. They asked him to walk again through his account of the night. They pointed out where it did not fit phone records, where it collided with footage, where his emotions seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous. They were patient but persistent, circling gradually toward the core question: where are they? There is a particular cruelty in the way lies stretch out the suffering of others. While he continued to deny knowledge or involvement, families waited, neighbors speculated, and the clock kept ticking. Every hour without answers deepened dread. Shannan's parents experienced what no parent should: helplessness tightened by distance and uncertainty, praying for a miracle while bracing for the worst possibilities they dared not voice. At the same time, the portrait of Chris himself became clearer. Investigators uncovered marital strain, financial difficulties, and the existence of an affair. These were not crimes in themselves, but they were context, and context matters. They revealed a man living two lives: the public family man and the private individual, constructing an escape from responsibility. This duality made the interviews on television feel even more chilling in retrospect. He had been crafting narratives long before cameras were rolling. As suspicion narrowed, empathy in the wider community shifted entirely toward the victims. People revisited Shannan's videos and posts, this time with the knowledge of what she did not yet know: the danger living inside her own home. They saw not just a social media personality, but a woman try to keep a marriage alive, raising her children with love, talking about the future with a hope that now hurts to watch. Her daughters, frozen in photographs with bright bows and open laughter, became symbols of innocence betrayed. By midweek, the investigation had reached a point of no return. The polite facade of cooperation was gone. The questions were sharper. The physical evidence and digital trails were converging toward a single conclusion that nobody wanted but could no longer avoid. The story he had told could not be sustained. Behind every new inconsistency, there was a deeper truth pressing to be acknowledged. What makes this stage of the case so emotionally heavy is the dual awareness: investigators growing certain of what happened, while the rest of the world still holds on to fragments of hope. There is a moment brief but unforgettable when denial is still possible, when the mind refuses to accept that a father could do the unthinkable. That moment was now closing. The neighbor's camera had done what human trust could not. It forced a confrontation between narrative and evidence, between performance and reality. The second section ends with attention fully drawn. Interviews have become performances under suspicion. The house is no longer merely a home, but a silent witness. The missing person flyers flutter in the summer heat, already, in a way no one wants to admit, memorials in waiting. The man at the center maintains calm words, but the walls around those words are closing in. The truth is no longer far away. It is sitting in the room with him, waiting for acknowledgement. And the world is about to learn not just that a crime has occurred, but the depth of betrayal at its core. When the truth finally surfaces in a case like this, it does not bring relief so much as a new kind of pain. Certainty ends a frantic searching, but it opens a door to grief that has no exit. After the admission, the investigation shifted from "are they alive?" to "how do we honor them, find them, and hold the responsible person to account?" That transition is devastating. It marks the moment when hope stops being rational, and love has to coexist with anger and disbelief. The community watched the final developments unfold with a mixture of sorrow and outrage. What had begun as a missing person plea transformed into a homicide investigation, then into a confession by the very person who had stood in front of cameras asking for help. Those interviews, replayed now, felt unbearable to watch. Every calm sentence, every carefully arranged expression took on a different meaning. They were not the words of a desperate husband, but of someone trying to maintain a facade while knowing exactly what had happened. That betrayal of collective empathy deepened the sense of violation. Law enforcement now had a dual responsibility: to document the full scope of what had been done and to ensure the court process would withstand scrutiny. They followed procedures with quiet precision, gathering remaining evidence, filing charges, preparing for hearings. These steps may appear mechanical from the outside, but within them lies a powerful truth: justice moves not with emotion, but with structure. It is one of the few ways society can respond when something irreparable occurs. As facts became public through court documents and official statements, the horror crystallized. It was not just that lives had been taken. It was the nature of the betrayal. A wife who trusted her husband. Two little girls who believed completely in the man who was supposed to protect them. A child yet to be born, whose life ended before it began. Without descending into sensational detail, it is enough to say this. They were harmed by the person who owed them unconditional safety. That reality alone is more chilling than any description. The courtroom phase brought its own emotional geography. There was no dramatic whodunit left to argue. There was acknowledgement of responsibility. The proceedings became less about uncovering surprise revelations and more about formally recognizing the weight of the crime. Shannan's family members faced a man who had shattered their lives. Their statements carried both heartbreak and dignity, speaking for those who could no longer speak for themselves. They described who Shannan was in life: her determination, humor, devotion, and who the girls were becoming, their personalities already vivid despite their young ages. People following the case felt a shared ache listening to those words. These were not headlines anymore. They were voices. They turned statistics into faces, legal charges into stolen futures. Anger and compassion coexisted: anger toward the act and compassion for the victims and those who love them. Those emotions are not contradictory. They are the natural human response to cruelty wrapped in familiarity. The sentence reflected the severity of the crime. Life without the possibility of parole ensured he would never again walk free. The courtroom did not cheer. Justice in such cases is somber, never celebratory. No decision, however firm, can balance the loss of a mother, two children, and an unborn baby. The law can confine a person, but it cannot heal the grief they leave behind. It can say never again, but it cannot say it did not happen. In the months that followed, the story lingered in the public consciousness for reasons beyond sensationalism. It struck a nerve about appearances, about how easily social media images of perfection can mask suffering and danger. People revisited smiling family photographs with knowledge that rewrote them. They reconsidered how carefully curated posts can conceal fractures. How often people assume they look happy is the same as they are safe. The case became a cautionary tale about the limits of what we think we know from the outside. It also reopened conversations about domestic violence in its less visible forms: emotional withdrawal, isolation, secret double lives, financial stress hidden behind pride. Not every strained marriage ends in tragedy. Most do not. But the warning signs in hindsight reminded many that dismissing intuition, ignoring abrupt personality changes, or minimizing fear can have consequences. Advocates used the case to emphasize support systems, early intervention, and the importance of taking concerns seriously even when outward images appear calm. Shannan's legacy, however, is not defined solely by the crime. Friends and family have worked to ensure that she and the girls are remembered for their lives, not their deaths. They share stories about her resilience, her sense of humor, her commitment to her children. They recall Bella's sweetness, Celeste's bold energy, the excitement surrounding the baby on the way. The humanizing of victims is an act of resistance against the way violence threatens to reduce people to headlines. To speak their names with love is to refuse to let the perpetrator be the center of a narrative. For investigators, the case reinforced something they already knew. Evil does not always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it wears a mask of normalcy, blending into routine, showing itself only in small inconsistencies, until those inconsistencies become impossible to ignore. The neighbor's camera became symbolic, not just of surveillance, but of truth of how actions leave traces no matter how carefully hidden intentions may be. It underscored the value of community attention and the role of ordinary people in seeking answers. There remains an uncomfortable question at the heart of this case. Why? Courts can determine guilt, but motive often exists in a murkier psychological terrain. Financial stress, infidelity, desire for control, and emotional detachment offer partial explanations, but never full justification. None of them come close to making sense of crossing the line from conflict to irreversible violence. Perhaps that is the final cruelty: some acts will always exceed the frameworks we have to understand them. Yet in the face of that incomprehensibility, the response of others showed something different about humanity. Strangers attended vigils. Neighbors left flowers. Support poured in for grieving families. People who never met Shannan or her daughters felt compelled to bear witness to their story. This collective mourning is, in its way, an assertion of values: that families deserve safety, that betrayal of trust on such a scale is intolerable, that communities will stand with victims even when they cannot undo what was done. The Chris Watts case remains lodged in public memory because it collapses many of our emotional defenses at once. It forces people to confront the idea that danger can arise inside the very spaces that should be most secure. It asks us to look beyond curated images and to listen closely when someone says something feels wrong. It invites empathy, not only for those who were lost, but for those left to carry the weight of grief, guilt, and unanswered questions. As the narrative closes, what endures is not the perpetrator's name, but the echo of lives interrupted. A woman who loved fiercely. 2 little girls whose laughter once filled a house. A child who would never take a first breath. Their absence is felt in birthdays that are not celebrated, in empty chairs at family gatherings, in the quiet moments when memory rushes in without warning. That is the true measure of the crime, not the headlines, not the trial, but the permanent space left behind where people should still be living. Justice, in the legal sense, has been served, but justice cannot resurrect. It can only recognize loss, restrain the one who caused it, and try in its limited way to say that some acts violate not only law, but the basic contract of humanity. The story ends in paperwork and prison terms, but it also continues in the lives of those who remember, advocate, and refuse to let violence be the final word. The case of Shannan Watts and her daughters is ultimately a story of profound betrayal and of the strength of those who survived its aftermath. It is a reminder to take seriously the quiet indicators of danger, to value compassion over appearances, and to honor victims not with voyeurism but with empathy and attention to the patterns that precede tragedy. Above all, it is a testament to the fact that truth, however delayed, finds its way through lies but arrives carrying a cost that no sentence can repay.